Welcome to week 12 tutorial, two voices and mixed values against the Cantus Firmus, only on Dr. E's Super Sounds of the 1570s, the radio station where the 70s survived. All right, cats and kittens, let's get down to it. Steps to follow. First, write the cadence. Second, approach the cadence using one of the techniques, either parallel tense, third, sixth, or full bourdon if possible, in first species. Then situate and write the other required technique and write it in first species. Connect with free counterpoint if necessary, and then add any embellishments to your solution. Remember that for the purposes of the homework, you have to have two cadences, one which is elided or evaded, and then one which is proper at the end. In my particular example, I'm using a short one, so there's only going to be one proper cadence at the end. Here's our initial Cantus Firmus, Da Jesus an den Kreuze stund, from the last verse, and I use this particularly because it's in Phrygian mode. Or, well, sort of ambiguously Phrygian. It's sort of an incomplete Phrygian or a hypophrygian mode, which has implications for the modal octave later on. Now let's give this a listen to. Okay, so our first task is to write the cadence out. So there's a few things to note here. First, I put the cadence in. It's a proper cadence with the proper suspension, noting, of course, that we are in Phrygian mode, so we do not raise the 7th scale degree. Because the 2-1 is already the semitone there. However, in a 3-voice setting, Phrygian cadences are a little bit weird, and so we have this Phrygian 3rd voice resolution, which moves down to the A, not the E. So remember that's on the cadences section of the chapter on 3-voice writing. This is the only mode that has this particularly unusual exception. But I think if you listen to it, you're going to hear really a strong resolution towards E, and the A just ends up kind of coming in as a form of color. Obviously we do this because it would be impossible in a cadential context to have a fully fleshed out chord on the dominant of the Phrygian mode, because that would involve a diminished 5th. So let's give this a listen to. Well, if that doesn't sound 1570s, I don't know what does. All right, so the next thing to do is to approach the cadence. So here I've decided to approach the cadence using the parallel 6 technique. Now remember that the parallel 6 technique, the parallel 6 are between the top voice, the top and middle voice. And you'll see that there's a series of parallel 6 between those voices. Here's the first one, second one, third one, and then after the suspension we have a 4th right there. The suspension, of course, doesn't break the model, it just embellishes it. Next thing that we have as part of the parallel 6 model is alternating 5ths and 3rds in the 3rd voice. So here we've got 5-3, and then here we have a second 5-3, and in fact we end on a 5 at the very end, preserving the pattern. So let's listen to this part. All right, so now that we've got our first technique in, we've got the approach to the cadence already written in first species, we're going to move on to adding a second technique. Pardon me. And so the second technique is going to be a series of parallel tenths. Now, what I've done is I've added the interval numbers between the top and bottom voice below the bottom voice, just so that we have them somewhere to refer to. So you can see that we've got a series of tenths between the top and bottom, between the outer voices, pardon me, all the way to here. And I'm particularly proud of this last one where we have a tenth landing on our arrival at the parallel 6. So there's this nice dovetailing between the two techniques. I felt very fancy, I have to say. Let's give this a listen to. Now our last step is to add free counterpoint and embellishments. Because I'm using a shortened example, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for free counterpoint between the techniques, but what I ended up doing is I moved, as you'll see at the beginning, I moved some of the pitches around so that it's not strictly in parallel tenths right off the bat. The parallel tenths start on the last half note of that measure. So this is sort of a free counterpoint introduction, if you will, to this phrase. Another thing to notice about how I've done the embellishments is that the entries of the entry of the cantus firmus is on a dissonance, right? So acting as the agent of a suspension, a double suspension. First, a 4-3 suspension in the top voice, as well as a 2-3 suspension in the bottom voice. So that's a good way of bringing a voice in as an agent of a suspension, and kind of creates interest and focuses the ear. One last thing to note is that you see this fourth here. This is a legal fourth because it is between the upper two voices, and fourths are now allowed in those cases. The rest of the embellishments, I think, should be fairly straightforward. And let's give this all a listen. My only beef with this particular example is that I don't really have a good modal octave anywhere in there. That's, I think, a bit of an artifact of the fact that I was using the last phrase of a melody, and I didn't have time to sort of stretch my limbs properly and kind of get really into context. So this, my big critique of this is that I don't really have a good modal octave. Also, the melody is a bit ambiguous. So I think my inclination would be to assume that the melody, because it's incomplete, that the melody is in hypophrygian, which gives me a better options in terms of what I can go try and get for the modal octaves in Phrygian mode. As you can see, the top voice almost gets to the modal octave between E and E. The bottom voice doesn't come close, but I think it would be easier for me to get those E octaves than B octaves, so I am going to interpret that middle voice as being hypophrygian, allowing me to be in the authentic modes in the outer voices. Okay. Last but not least, we've got coming up down the pipe, we've got do only number 4 from homework 10, because that sort of summarizes all of the techniques. So don't bother with numbers 1, 2, or 3 unless you want to do them for your own personal edification. And these will be submitted as the usual time on Monday next week. That's it for us. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay healthy. Take care, y'all.